Hello everyone and welcome back to Curious Kellen. Today, as I'm sure you guessed, we are going to be learning how to play chess. The reason I'm making this video is because I think a lot of people are sitting down to learn chess for the first time. They open their board, they set up the pieces, and then they look up a video of how to play chess. And then they find themselves watching an hour-long video about all the different kinds of pieces, all the different moves, they lose interest, and then they go and do something else. So, today, I am going to try and get through all the basic rules in a short amount of time, make it short and sweet so that you can get to playing right away. Here we go. Okay, so the first thing we need to do when looking at chess is look at the setup of the board. Now, I'll show you really quick the pieces that we're looking at. This is the pawn. Then over here we have a rook. Then over here we have the knight. Then the bishop. The queen. And then the king. So these, the king. We have all these different pieces here. And of course it mirrors on the other side. Now the one thing we have to remember is we have to notice the colors. And the first thing we need to know is white on right. Now the way that this board is set up, it has the numbers and letters on it for chess notation. But if you don't have that, you need to remember that a white square should be in the right-hand corner of your board. So you wouldn't want to have a black square there if the board were flipped, for example. So remember white on right. And then the other thing we need to remember is queen on color. Because you'll notice that the queens on each side of the board and the kings on each side of the board face directly across from each other. They're not diagonally. So we remember queen on color. So the white queen goes on the white square. The black queen goes on the black square. It's fairly simple. We have a row of pawns on the front row on each side. And then it goes rook on the outside, knight, bishop, and then obviously the king and queen are in the middle on their respective colors. So the bishops coming from outside, bishops, knights, rooks. And then, of course, the rows of pawns in the middle. The next thing we need to know is how the pieces actually move. So on a pawn's first move, a pawn can move either 2 spaces or it can move 1 space. Either is fine. And if after you've done a move of 1, you cannot decide to do a move of 2 later. After a pawn has moved for the first time, it can no longer do its two-space move. Now, the way that you capture with a pawn is, let's say I had this pawn here, and you had this pawn here. The way that you capture with pawns is diagonally. So if you were to capture my pawn here, you would capture like this and take my pawn. If I had a pawn directly in front of you, they wouldn't be able to capture each other or attack each other. So you might notice that if I have a pawn here, if I was already here and you made this move, I could capture. So pawns can always capture each other when they're on the diagonals. It just depends on who gets there first, which is, of course, all a part of the strategy. Also, I must say the point of the game is to get your opponent in checkmate, which we will talk about in a minute. So the whole reason you're doing all these captures is to basically eliminate your other opponent's team and get yourself into a position where you are in a winning position. Now, the next piece we're going to look at is the bishop. So if we move this pawn forward, it allows our bishop to move. Our bishop moves diagonally, and it can move any number of spaces diagonally on any turn, which basically means it's always going to stay on the same color. So if you ever haven't promoted a pawn, which we'll talk about a little bit later, and you find that you have, let's say, 2 bishops on the same color, they're both on the same color, you've done something wrong. But bishops move on the diagonal however many spaces they would like, and they capture the same way as well. So let's say I have a pawn out here, and we're starting like this. Let's say this is a position. I have a pawn out here. You can capture with your bishop. It captures the same way that it moves. And then one thing I must mention is, actually we'll get to this right now. The other piece we're going to look at is the knight. and the knight is the only piece that can jump over other pieces. So, for example, with your bishop, if I had my pawn out here and you wanted to take that pawn, you can't jump over this pawn of your own to get to that pawn. You are unable to do that. The only piece that is able to do that is the knight. And the knight has kind of a tricky move, so pay attention to the way this guy moves. He moves 2 spaces in one direction and then another space at a 90-degree angle to that direction. So that sounds a little complicated, but he just makes an L. So, for example, if we want to do this, we would go 2 spaces forward and then 1 space over here. So he can jump over. So we went 2 spaces forward and then 1 space right here. Now you can also calculate that as doing 1 space this way and then 2 spaces. It doesn't really matter because you're jumping over pieces either way. Knights can jump over, any number of pieces. And of course, if this space would open, we could also move 2 spaces this way and then 1 space forward. So 2 spaces in one direction and then 1 space 90 degrees in another direction. So we can make that move as well. That covers the knight. Now the next piece is the rook, and the rook is probably the most basic to remember. He just moves along the straight lines any number of spaces, and I forgot to mention the knight captures the way it moves. So if I had a pawn there, you could capture with your knight. He just moves to the space he wants to capture, given that it's a legal move that he can make, and that is the way to capture with a knight. As I was saying, the rook can move any number of spaces in the perpendicular angles, so kind of the opposite of the bishop. And of course, if the rook wants to capture a piece, same as with the knight and the bishop, if the pawn is in his path, he can come and capture that way. The next piece we're going to look at is the queen. So the queen is essentially the combination of a rook and a bishop. This just means that the queen can move diagonally in any direction for any number of spaces, as well as perpendicularly along just the rows and columns. So the queen is probably your most valuable piece. You're going to want to make sure that you protect her at all costs. Except, of course, for the king, which we're going to look at next. And, of course, as always, the queen captures when there is a piece in her way. Same with diagonally, if you wanted to capture that way. The king is very much like the queen, except he is limited to only 1 space of direction. So the king can move any direction that he would like, but only 1 space. So exactly like the queen, except limited to only 1 space. Now that covers all of, and of course the king can capture, and he would capture like this, moving in his regular moving pattern and capturing as he would. So the only piece that has a strange capturing pattern is the pawn. So the pawn only moves forward, and if you wanted to capture, you would capture diagonally. Okay, so the next thing we need to look at is what check is and what checkmate is. Checkmate is the goal of the game in chess. So let's look at check first. So the first thing is, let's pretend that this is the position and we want to see what check is. If I put my bishop here, you can see that your king is in danger of being captured on the next move, unless you decide to make that, to fix that. So if I move here as myself, I would say check. And in higher levels of chess, they don't say check, and there's things about that. But at your beginning level, you're going to say check whenever you put your opponent in a position where you would capture their king in the next move. Now we can defend against check by moving our bishop here to block there. I could capture your bishop, and then you could capture with either the knight or the queen. Or of course you could move a pawn here to block your king from being attacked by this bishop, and then I would have to move out of the way. So that is what check is, and with a similar example, we're going to see how the move checkmate works. So the move we're going to look at here is called, I believe it's the 4-move checkmate. And essentially what happens is, let's pretend that this is what this looks like. If you haven't developed anything over here, I can come in with my queen and put you in checkmate. And as you can see, the thing that's really important here is this bishop. This bishop is guarding this queen. And what we can do is, as the king, if this bishop wasn't here, we could just capture the queen and we would get out of check. But because this queen is being guarded by this bishop, the king cannot capture, because if the king captured this queen, for example, then the bishop would just capture the king. Game over. So that is called checkmate, because the king cannot do anything. The king, if this queen wasn't here, the king could move out of the way of check, because now he is no longer in a position where he's being attacked. The king, you could, of course, if this knight was out here, for example, this knight could come and capture the queen like that. But in this specific position, the king cannot move out of the way. There are no other pieces that can stop the queen from attacking the king, because the king cannot attack the queen herself because it's guarded by the bishop. This can happen with any piece making an attack. For example, let's pretend that the king is out here for some reason, and we somehow have gotten ourselves to, this position. Let's say we are here, and for some reason we have gotten ourselves in this position. Things don't look super great until we make the, whoops, we need to change one more thing. I'm going to put this pawn here. This doesn't look like a very good position. You probably wouldn't ever want to move your king out this far without moving your other pieces. Your king is in grave danger at the moment. And the next move we could make is this move here. And I believe that would be, oh, that's not quite checkmate. I apologize, because we would need, the king would be able to move here. So we're going to fix that by putting, we'll pretend that our bishop is right here. Like I said, this is not a very common scenario, so I'm just trying to give you an example. So if I were to move here in this position, the king would be in what is called checkmate, because he can't capture this pawn with any piece. He has no piece to capture this pawn, because if he captured with the king, this pawn was guarding this pawn, so the king would be captured by the pawn. King cannot move here because the bishop is in the way. King cannot move here because it's guarded both by this bishop and by the queen. And this entire row is, of course, guarded by the queen, so he can't move here, can't move there. Queen moves diagonally, so covers this space as well as this space, can't move there. And this space is covered by the pawn right here. So in this position, the king would be in what is called checkmate, and the game would be over. However, if we were to have, let's say this pawn was right here, when this pawn makes this play, we would capture with this pawn, and then that could prevent a checkmate for us. I don't think it actually would. Well, it would, because then, let's take that back just a little bit. If this was the position and I made this play, you would capture with this pawn. I would probably, let's say I were to capture back with that pawn, then you would capture with your king. Your king isn't in danger in this position, so crisis averted. So that is the goal of the game, is to put your opponent in checkmate. They cannot move their king. There's no way to capture the attacking piece, and the king cannot move out of the way. So that is the main goal of the game. The other thing we need to look at here are some interesting things with pawns. So if we get, let's say, let's just clear these out of the way. Let's say as the game is moving on, we have interesting things going on over here. We'll just pretend like this is something that would actually happen in a game. It's a very interesting position, probably not super likely. But let's say throughout the course of the game, we're able to get our pawn to the end of the board. When we get our pawn to the end of the board, we get to do what is called promotion. Let's say if our king had been taken out of the game, that would be the end of the game. Let's say our queen had been taken out of the game earlier by some random piece that we had lost our queen and we want to get her back. When our pawn gets to the end of the board, we can promote. So we can promote to a queen if we'd like. And when you can promote your pawn to any of the pieces on the back row in your starting position, any of the pieces in the back row, as long as it's not the king. So if you want, you could promote this pawn to a rook. You could promote this pawn to a knight. You could promote this pawn to a bishop. Or, of course, you could promote this pawn to a queen. Now, I know the way I'm making it look here makes it look like I'm taking this knight and putting it here instead. But actually, you would have this knight here still. You would get another knight over here, so you would have 3 knights in total. So you're gaining another higher, more advanced piece than your pawn once you get it to the end of the board. And it doesn't take an extra turn. Right when you move to that space, that's when you promote. So if you were to promote to a queen, it would become a queen right there. That is a really important thing to keep in mind, especially if you have a pawn right here. And let's say if this bishop was here and we were to make this move, it would become a queen, and it would put the king in check. Not checkmate, because he could move out of the way, or he could block like this, but it would be check nonetheless. Another interesting thing that we could look at, that I'm not going to go into super great detail here, because it's a little bit more advanced, takes a little bit of time to understand, is the move en passant, which essentially what happens here is, let's say you have this pawn, and I move my pawn 2 for its starting move. I move 2 spaces. In the original game of chess, pawns could only move 1, and they decided, oh, let's speed up the game. It's taking too long, so let's decide to make a rule that on its first move, a pawn can move 2 spaces. The way they counteract that, though, is if you move 2 spaces and you have a pawn right here, on your move, you can capture that pawn by making this move. Because if you think about it, in the old game, if you would have played your pawn like that, you could capture like this. Now we're able to move our pawn 2 spaces, but we can still capture like that. And it looks a little weird because that's not how pawns capture. They capture diagonally, but that is a legal move. You're going to probably want to do some more research on that. You cannot make this move after the opportunity is gone. So let's say I move there, and then you move here with your knight. You could not, and then let's say I make a random move. You could not then capture with en passant. You have to make the capture right as soon as the opportunity is available. Once you leave it alone, make a different move, then this pawn is safe. You cannot do an en passant capture. The only other move that is actually a really important move that I would highly recommend spending some time studying is called castling. So let's say we have a position like this. You notice we have two open spaces between our king and our rook. And for one move, this just counts as one move. We'd say castle, we move our king over to, and then we replace it with the rook. And this just gives your king a nice sturdy position over here in the corner so that you're not getting attacked right from the middle. You cannot castle through check. So let's say my bishop was out here. You cannot castle through check. If you castled, this square is covered by this bishop. So you cannot castle through check in that way. You could block with your pawn, and then that square isn't covered, and then you castle. And then you cannot castle through check. You cannot castle into check. So let's move this like this, and let's say I had this bishop here. If you were to castle, that would castle you into check. You cannot do that. And then you cannot castle out of check either. So if you were in check here, you're in check. You cannot just castle to get out of it. You would have to block first and then eventually make a move. And I'm not I believe that is the rule. Like I said, double check on these. You can also castle queenside, is what we call it, if you get these pieces out here. This is not realistic at all, not a very realistic position, but if this space were open here, you could move the king too, and then you bring the rook around to the other side. So you can castle on both the king and queen side. I highly recommend watching some videos about that because that is a lifesaver once you get further advanced in the game. Most professional players castle because it gives them a longer time to think, and it also gives them, it gets these pieces out on the board so that they're playing, and then it also opens this rook up a little bit more, because after you get this rook over in here, then he has a lot more room if you have this pawn out of the way to get out there. But when the rook's all snug up in the corner, it's harder for the rook to get into the game. So highly recommend watching some videos about castling. And although that is the basic general rules for the game of chess, of course there are certain strategies and checkmates, specific kinds of checkmates, specific openings that you can play in chess, but that is the general basic rules for chess. Thank you everyone for watching. I hope you enjoyed learning chess for the first time, or even coming back to refresh your memory on a couple rules that you had forgotten. Thank you for watching. My brother and I have been playing lots of chess during the pandemic, so I really wanted to make a video about chess. It's a great game. I love playing it. My brother and I have actually gotten pretty good playing against each other. But this game is hundreds of years old, which shows just how timeless it is. It's a great game. It's classic. So I'm glad that you took the time to sit down with me and learn all the basic moves. That's great for you. I hope you enjoy playing more and more chess. You can play, with a board in real life, or you can also get an account on chess.com. I use chess.com a lot. It's really easy to use, so I'd recommend using that if you don't have a lot of people to play in real life with. But other than that, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give this video a like. And of course, if you want to keep learning new and interesting things, subscribe. Also, if you have any video ideas, please leave them in the comments, or even if you just want to talk a little bit about what you learned from this video about chess, leave that in the comments. But other than that, that's going to be it for today. Stay curious, everyone, and I will see you in the next video.